Welcome to Barenaked Money, the podcast where we strip down the complex world of finance to its bare essentials. With your hosts, Josh Sheluk and Colin White, portfolio managers with Verecan Capital Management.
Welcome to the next edition of Barenaked Money, where Josh and I are about to get naked about tariffs. Now, before I let Josh talk, I did my research leading into this, so I asked some really smart people about, hey, what we're doing a podcast on tariffs, and one of them sent me a very detailed and comprehensive list of all the tariffs that are currently in effect, and they thought that would be useful for the podcast. Josh, do you think that we should be discussing in detail exactly what the tariffs are as of this moment in time? Do you think that would age well by the time that this podcast actually airs?
I think we should start by listing everyone. Colin, how many? How long is the list?
Oh, it's comprehensive. We could make this a complete snapshot in time. For this picosecond, this is exactly what the tariffs are at this moment in time, real and imagined. But it was a very comprehensive list. I was a little impressed it was able to be pulled together as quickly as it was. I think AI was involved, but do you know how many tariffs are out there, Josh? It's almost innumerable.
Yeah, I would imagine it's probably pretty significant. And what I'm kind of interested, I wonder if your list identifies tariffs that were in place prior to a few months ago versus ones that are new. Does it differentiate at all?
I could ask that follow-up question. I'm sure I would get an equally comprehensive list, but I think we should leave that to the history books, because there's going to be somebody who's going to write a paper or two or three, or this could become a university course at some point on the exact timeline of what tariffs were introduced when, and if they ever actually were announced and implemented, or implemented as announced, or implemented but never announced, and in all the different versions thereof.
Well, I think it's important to say we're recording this on March 14th, the morning of March 14th. And if something doesn't age well,
10:38 a.m. Atlantic time.
Exactly. Because it was funny yesterday during our investment committee meeting, Dave, I think it was, said, well, tariffs are in place. And then we said, are they? And he said, you know what? I haven't checked in the last 55 minutes, so I'm not really sure. And that's the state of the world at the moment.
Introduce this as a bit of a humorous way to point out, oh my God, this is like, talking about sand running through an hourglass. Like, you really don't know what you're grabbing, or what the current state of things really is. And, that's part of the problem. That's part of the issue. And that's the stage that we're standing on when we stand up here to pontificate profusely about tariffs. So I can't wait for your list, Josh, because Josh always comes up with better lists. It's going to be a more meaningful list. It's going to be a list that's evergreen. It's going to be a timeless list, right, Josh?
I did approach in my list, for the record, just a list of questions, but I did approach it from the idea of let's try to ask and answer some questions that are meaningful and will be permanently meaningful. Like, even if tariffs change in the next 2 months, which I guarantee they will, something that we could still use and still reflect on as something that can maybe help us think about making decisions, even if we're not going to actually make any decisions based off of it.
Well, the old adage, there's something to learn, so, I guess maybe that's the best way to preface this, or to situate this podcast. What can we learn? Like, what learnings are there in the current set of tumult that we're living through, and what information is out there that people can use to make decisions on that's meaningful?
I'm going to start with a track that I don't think anyone would expect me to go down,
so excited,
including probably you. And I haven't shared my list with you, so I'm going to really be putting you on the spot with this one. But I want you to start by giving me and the listeners 3 good things that are coming out of this tariff war. 3 positives.
I love this. They were discussing interprovincial trade barriers in Canada is my personal favorite. And you know what? I really don't care how we got in this room. The fact we're in this room, it was going to take something of this level to make this conversation happen. I love that. The fact that people in Quebec are chanting, "Oh, Canada," I think is another, really big upside of this. The third one, I think, is a bit further out. I'm not sure it's happening, but I think it's got the potential to happen. That Canada as an entity is going to now consider, how do we become more competitive? And, how do we become stronger in the face of adversity? As a parent, I always loved seeing my kids go through adversity because it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to learn some skills and to become a stronger individual. And the third one, I'm going to pause and say, I'm not sure we're going to do that, but I think that it gives us an opportunity that would not be afforded to us in easy times. So, we have a chance here as a country to double down and get more competitive in a whole bunch of ways. And they've measured it economically, and the decrease in productivity per person GDP and stuff like that. And there's different measures that, again, I think have some efficacy, but maybe are not complete. But the general idea that Canada is not necessarily a competitive place to do business, we could come out of this stronger and better going forward. So I don't know. Did I disappoint you, Josh? Those are three off the top of my head.
I was kind of going down exactly the same track with the ideas when I had thought about this question. And again, I don't think people really realized a few months ago that we have all these interprovincial trade barriers up. Why we do? It's just why we have international trade barriers up as well. Is somebody or some entity or some group is trying to protect their own interests, and it ends up being negative over the bigger picture. The pie shrinks because you're trying to protect your piece. And again, I don't think people really realize that we have all these interprovincial trade barriers up. So the fact that we're really talking about tearing that stuff down right now is amazing. And that could be a long-term win.
But there's also another level to it too. It's also the way Confederation was structured, that powers were given to provinces that really don't belong at the provincial level. I mean, we've discussed this within our industry, that we have provincial securities commissions that produce interprovincial trade.
Absolutely insane.
Right. Yeah. But that goes right back to the founding document of the country. And, in that founding document, there are provincial powers that honestly, in today's day and age, don't belong in other subsections of countries. So sometimes it's not even, I want to protect my industry. It's, I've got the responsibility. An example, I think maybe you shared it with me, that Ontario has got a different rule about the upholstery that's allowed to be used in cars compared to the rules in Quebec about the upholstery you can use in a car. So therefore, there's issues sometimes with a car manufactured in Ontario not being allowed in Quebec. And it's, part of me says it's not necessarily that they were trying to make it that way, but just they had that responsibility. So their group of experts came up with a different answer than that group of experts. Or maybe it is an artificially manufactured way of being a protectionist, but it's really hard to untangle that. The professional accountants of Canada is going through this. There's the CPA Canada, Ontario and Quebec have bowed out. So there's no national accounting standards in Canada. So, is that an interprovincial trade barrier, or is that just stupid the way the provinces have certain powers and have them mailing along? But hey, now that Quebec is chanting, "Oh, Canada," anything's possible. But the provinces may go way closer on a whole bunch of things.
Yeah. Oh, the competitive thing is interesting too, because I think is there a possibility that we really make a push on that front, but also just with deepening other international trade relationships, I think could be a very positive thing. Obviously, hopefully, we're always going to have a very close trading relationship with the US because of our proximity. It's just a marriage of convenience more than anything else. Yeah, it makes sense. It would be stupid to do anything else. Like, it would be stupid to try to, import bourbon, for lack of an easier idea, from, South Korea or something like that. But you can't even do that because bourbon's very protected. But the point is, if we can try to deepen some of the relationships with some other countries, then I think, again, long-term positive potentially, if we're able to also mend some of our relationships here in North America.
Well, it's funny because that's a talking point that people are like, hey, maybe we could go trade with other people. And I mentioned that to a CEO of a company who they do business, I think, 138 different countries around the world. And he looked at me and says, "You don't fucking think I've been trying?"
Yeah.
If I could sell something somewhere else, I'd already be selling it there. I mean, it's not as if I said I'm not going to do anything else anywhere else in the world. I mean, you think there's like a tap I can turn on? No, I'm already fully staffed up. I already have sales agents in all those countries. It's not something that we weren't doing. Like, thanks for the feedback. But if I could sell something in another country, I'd already be doing it. So it was a kind of a funny and spot on response to a
Sure.
talking point that I think a lot of us sitting on the outside go, well, we should just go trade with other countries. And the people who have those relationships are going, we are.
Yeah.
It's not something we weren't.
Yeah.
Thanks for the idea.
Yeah. Fair enough. I think there's probably times where we can be accused of being overly optimistic on things. So I don't want to just present the optimistic case, the rosy case on this, but leaving aside, like let's assume 3 months from now, all this stuff has blown over again, and we're kind of back to our normal, uh, tenuous, we'll call it, trading relationship with our North American peers. What do you think are the long term negatives of this? Even if the short term stuff blows over and tariffs all go away, what are the long term negatives potentially of this?
I think this is allowing more deglobalization to creep in, because I think, people get conditioned, companies get conditioned, and they go, you know, here we go again. So I'm going to take steps to protect myself from this. And those steps, ostensibly, I want to believe that if you make the assumption that the current arrangement, that things are in the most efficient form possible, and that's a bit of a big stretch, but if you say that, given the current landscape and the current rules, regulations, and current tariffs in place, that everything is as efficient as it can be, and everybody reacts by saying, okay, I want to build a little more safety into the system. That normally means a little more inefficiency in the system, which would normally mean it's a little bit more expensive, which would be inflationary. Now, at the end of it, this may go back to, what we hoped for earlier in the conversation, that, Canada's going to become stronger, more self-sufficient. Stronger self-sufficient typically would mean it's inflationary because it's not quite as efficient or cheap to do it that way. Otherwise, we would have been doing it that way all along. So this is just adding another constraint to how economic activity is occurring. So we're artificially building in a bit more protection. That's an additional constraint. And when you add an artificial constraint that is not driven by a profit motive, typically you're sacrificing the profit motive. So it should be a little bit more inflationary. But again, as to how much, because inflationary, substitution's a thing. If something becomes more expensive in one way, that means people stop doing it. And I'm not even going to, I'm going to tongue in cheek say it and hope not too many lobster fishermen are listening. But the fact that China just hit us with lobster tariffs on top of the US lobster tariffs, I'm kind of excited that I'm not going to get to eat lobster 4 or 5 days a week, because it's going to be way cheaper than chicken or steak.
Yeah.
That's terrible. That's absolutely terrible for the lobster industry and the infrastructure that they've built to ship live lobsters all over the world, and the millions of dollars that are spent to service that market, that are just going to get decimated for a little while. I'm going to do my part. I will eat as much lobster as I possibly can consume in order to do my part to be a better Canadian. And I think that there'll be a number of us that'll stand up and contribute in those kind of ways. But I think every time you see a new threat rear its head, the natural reaction for everybody is to build up some protections against it. And I think that that's generally going to be inflationary. But I'll save my challenge to you later. But before we end this pod, I want you to address the question of, how many other factors are playing out in the background of this trade war. Because we're talking about like one dimension of what's going on. But behind the scenes, there's an economic cycle and economic activity going on that may or may not be influenced by the current trade war. That I think some of that stuff's more important than the current state of trade to, the forces when it comes to inflation, pro-inflationary and disinflationary and deflationary.
Okay.
Let me ask it better.
Sure.
How much do tariffs really matter? We're watching employment numbers, we're watching GDP numbers, all of which you could argue are going to be affected one way or another, but they already are on a path. They have a strength and or weakness. They already have,
Yeah.
there's already data points there. Tariffs may or may not be influencing those things, but is there anything else in those underlying data points in your mind, top 3 things that are more important to the outcome of what we're going to see in the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months than tariffs?
So I think tariffs themselves are not the biggest thing, but when they're the change at the margin, they might become the biggest thing. So what I mean by that is, like, employment matters way more than tariffs, just in a vacuum for
Yep.
economic progress and productivity and all of that. But if tariffs create an uncertainty or demolish an auto industry overnight, then you're going to have unemployment, and unemployment is going to lead to a recession, most likely. So the tariffs themselves are not necessarily the problem. It's all the spillover effects that tariffs can create. And I think economically we're on a decent footing at the moment, or at least the recent last 6-month data would say that we're in a decent spot.
Yep.
In the US, especially, in Canada, maybe a little bit less so, but still holding up okay. Like, most of the employment numbers, which are obviously super important for all kinds of reasons, most of those have been stable, let's call it. So
Yep.
not maybe at the absolute best situation that we've seen over the past few years, but stable over the past 6 months.
And just ask a question there. To me, that stability is in the face of some of the uncertainties already baked in.
That's
It's
true.
been
Yeah,
it's been uncertain for a while now. Now you
it
could argue
has.
that the
Yeah.
tempo is increased now, and it's more uncertain now than it was a few months ago. But there was a level of uncertainty already baked into some of the numbers. I think there's been enough of a lag. Like, Trump was elected and he's become president, and so some of the numbers are already affected by some of the uncertainty that was expected, and
Yeah.
they remain stable, which I don't think is a small thing.
You're absolutely right. I think that's a good point. So that's kind of the employment side. I think the inflation side is maybe equally as important to the employment
Yeah.
side. And what we've seen there again is stability and inflation within the range of where we want it. Now, the challenge here is, again, one of expectations. And does even the thought or idea of tariffs lead us to different behavior? And what we've been seeing over the past couple months, even though our inflation numbers haven't really changed, inflation expectations have been creeping back up. And that's dangerous, because inflation expectations can be a bit of a self-fulfilling thing. We still don't know exactly economically what leads to inflation, but one of the prevailing thoughts is that inflation it happens because of inflation expectations. So if inflation expectations increase, then that could naturally lead to more inflation, even without any tariffs in place. So that's a real risk as well. So tariffs create spillover risks, like a bit of a domino effect with other very important aspects economically. And I think that's the risk of these things. And certainly, from the smart people that I've seen that are out there that have made estimates on what semi-permanent, I'll call them, tariffs would do, it's unequivocally negative for growth, and unequivocally positive for inflation, which I'm a little bit more skeptical of. But it's
Well,
not. It wouldn't be a good thing. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think it's an inflationary force now. We already seem to have an inflation situation and a job situation that is fairly concrete. So the amount of disruption it's reflected in the numbers now has been absorbed, and it hasn't really moved the needle too much yet. And again, it may still move the needle. But I also am of the opinion that once the economy adjusts to a permanent level of tariffs, it's going we're going to impede growth for a period of time. I don't think that it's reasonable to say that this is a permanent impediment. What is the period? Is it 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? How long does it take to spin up a new aluminum smelter in Michigan?
Yeah.
If that's what has to happen, right?
Yeah. Well, I think in theory, tariffs are trade barriers, and trade barriers should have some type of permanent negative impact to growth, to the extent that tariffs are permanent. The inflationary thing, though, is a different story, right? If you throw tariffs on everything, the inflationary aspect happens overnight, and that runs for, how long? And then maybe we go back to a more normalized situation on the inflation side. Or even if tariffs are inflationary and impacting growth in a negative way, then at some point that negative growth is going to feed through to less inflation as well. So there are some sort of stabilizing mechanisms here that I don't think anybody really wants to explore. Even Trump, I don't think he wants to explore it either. I don't know, but I'd be skeptical. But it's really hard to know.
Well, I want to go back to your very first question, Josh, about the upside here, and let me go deep. Are you ready to go deep for a minute with me?
Yes, let's do it.
I think that the idea of globalization was something that was chased for decades. But in the chase for globalization, the power rested with the international companies that are operating across different borders. And an unelected group was getting to decide where things got produced and could be argued had a disproportionate influence within those countries because they were able to play countries off against each other. So the power went from the elected governments of the various countries to the corporations that were playing countries off against each other to act in their own best interest. There are those who argue, and again, I think that there's a little bit of truth in a lot of different arguments, that maybe the power had gone too far. The fact that the auto industry has free flow of goods across Mexico, Canada, and the US, yeah, we got cheaper cars out of that. But you also saw, and again, maybe coincidentally, the evaporation of a lot of the middle class in the US.
Yeah.
No, I'm not a proponent saying that the two are directly connected, but you could make an argument that the globalization ended up hollowing out different countries and was not done to the best interest of all of the working class in all of the countries. So there, again, this is an argument being made by some on the fringe that, getting away from globalization and getting things to be more aligned with the residents of each individual country, maybe the pendulum swings back.
Sure. Well, that would certainly be a certain Republicans' supposed argument and part of his policy campaign. I'm quite skeptical myself that we're just going to say, okay, let's onshore all of our manufacturing again. I don't think that's going to happen.
Oh, that's silly.
Yeah. What I think is more likely is like, okay, we're not going to hire 10,000 employees for this factory, but we are going to build a bunch of new robots for this factory now that we have to onshore again. And that could be pretty cool. So I'm a bit skeptical of that argument, but let me match your deepness for a second and say, how about this as an idea for optimism? So you said, and I think this makes sense, that if you're more resilient, you're potentially less efficient, like the whole just-in-time manufacturing and all that. But what if you look at it over a longer time horizon, like a 20 to 25 year time horizon, and you look at something like COVID hit? And that, I think part of the reason why that was such an inflationary event for us was that we had all of these perfect efficiencies, supposedly perfect efficiencies in our supply chains. And what happens if we maybe take a little bit of a year-to-year hit to make things a little bit more redundant and a little bit less efficient, a little bit more resilient? But if you look at it over the course of like a 20, 25, 30-year time horizon, you avoid that one spike, that one COVID spike, or that one, there's a war, the spike because of the war, that wipes out all of the the incrementally negative impacts that you had over the prior 2 decades. You can wipe that all out by just being more efficient in that one year, 2 year period, or whatever it is. And in some cases, that could make everything a lot better and more effective and more efficient and all that, and with a bit more of a longer term viewpoint.
Sound like you're arguing for gold, Josh. It's right once every 10 years. Therefore, we need it.
Well, I mean, it's right now. It's the first time in like kind of 50 years, it seems, but once in a generation is probably not enough to argue that point, but maybe we have more shock events over the next little while. Who knows?
But I'm going to go deep on your deep, because you introduced another whole fucking thing. Just as a throwaway comment in the middle of what you said is like, yeah, we don't need a middle class. We're just going to go straight to robots. Well, maybe that's where the efficiency comes, right? Maybe with the necessity, some other invention again, and we're making a big leap, and it's interesting as everybody's making. It's going to be less efficient, unless it isn't. Unless this is what drives us to actually invest in technology using AI and robots, and everything actually gets more efficient coming out of this because of the pressure that things go under, right?
Yeah. Sure. We probably do need a strong middle class, for the record. It might not be those middle class people working in factories. That just might not be what it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'm not against the middle class, the strong middle class. Well, holy crap, we're in trouble again, aren't we?
Yeah.
Our
That was danger.
Our empathy is not showing.
Yes. Well, here's one that's not going to show our empathy, or my empathy anyway, with this question. But I trust, trust me and believe me, we are very empathetic about some of the human impacts of these things. But I want to ask you a financial question. So I'm going to give you $1 million to invest, and you have a 3-year time horizon for this investment. You got to build a diversified portfolio of some sort to see this grow over 3 years. I'm going to give you 4 scenarios. You have to rank the scenarios from this is the best situation for my 3-year diversified investment portfolio, and this is the worst situation. Okay.
So is this a blind ranking? Like you're going to give me one, I got to pick 1 to 4 and then select the other ones?
No. I'm going to give you all 4.
All 4. Oh, okay. All right.
No, here, scenario number 1, you have a global pandemic to deal with. Scenario number 2, you have 10% inflation to deal with. Scenario number 3, you have a war. Scenario number 4, you have tariffs, just like we do today, this whole tariff kerfuffle. Rank 1 to 4 is like, this is most attractive for me to invest through versus the least attractive for me to invest.
I'll go pandemic.
That's most or least attractive?
Most attractive. I'll get there.
Okay.
See, I'll get there. All right.
Okay.
I get the answer, right? You asked the question, I get to give the answer.
I'm just surprised there. You went there first. Go for it though. Pandemic number 1. Okay.
So I go pandemic number 1. I would go inflation number 2. And war, and what was the
tariffs? Our current tariff environment. Yeah.
I'll go tariffs and then war.
Okay. Interesting. Very interesting.
So here's the rationale. So right now we are fighting with each other. Right? There's a conflict, and it's making everything more complicated. It's making everything less efficient. My feeling, and this is pure science fiction, if we went through another pandemic right now, we now have to concentrate on fighting something else. It's more unifying. Like we now we don't have time for the shitardery we're going through now and arguing about where the aluminum is made. Like we don't have time for all of that other pettiness. It becomes something that's like we all have a common thing we're fighting against now.
Sure.
And I think given 3 years, and if we look back to the last pandemic, 3 years in, economically things were looking pretty good. I think it would actually clean the slate from a lot of the pettiness that's going on and remove the oxygen from the room about having stupid arguments. We'd have to get much more aligned with what we're doing. So that's why I would pick that. And again, I think I put tariffs number 2. I'm trying to remember.
I think you had inflation was number 2 for you.
Inflation. 3 years is enough time to get inflation under control, and I'll ride that wave for 3 years. And I think that central bank, I give central banks credit for it, but you and I don't know that it's central banks or whether just 3 years is enough time for inflation to work its way out of the system.
Yeah.
But I think 3 years is enough time horizon that inflation would go away. We can debate later whether we give anybody credit for that. And I think, my portfolio could do fine.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. See, I had, for me, the inflationary period, that was the most difficult to deal with because it like the pandemic. And it's a bit of a guessing game as to what the next pandemic could look like, right? But, it was very much a shock and then recovery. And I think things happened so quickly. We got over it so quickly in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, we're still scarred. But in a lot of ways, we got over it so quickly that for investors, by the time you're like, oh, boy, this is bad, things were actually kind of already good again. So you didn't really have that much time to do damage to yourself by, panicking or blowing out your portfolio at the worst possible time. So I felt like that was maybe less of a bad event, but nonetheless, very economically damaging. Inflation for me is, it's tough because everything kind of gets hurt. Like you don't have anywhere to hide in the inflationary. And we saw this through 2022, right? Stocks were down, but bonds were down as well. And bonds had their worst period of time investment wise in forever, basically. So that makes things in my mind, very challenging to manage a portfolio, even a diversified portfolio. You don't have a lot of protection anywhere that you look.
Yeah, no, you're going to go through it. Like, inflation is going to cause that disruption. Again, my take on the question was I had 3 years to ride it out.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I think given 3 years, I can ride that wave. It'll be bad for a year, and then that guy, I have enough time in there that I would be okay at the end of it.
Yeah. And see, for me, tariffs, especially this kind of like tenuous tariff environment that we're in now, where they may or may not be in place, like I think that is well uncertain and concerning. Also, something that can be dealt with reasonably well with a well diversified and balanced portfolio.
I'll completely argue with you there that the worst scenario is that we remain this uncertain for the next 3 years. If there's absolutely no direction for the next 3 years and we don't know whether we're coming or going 3 years from now, that will be the worst. It's going to paralyze everybody. It's paralyzing people right now. Companies are not spending money. They're not taking on projects. They're not building factories. Everything's paralyzed. I mean, my argument would be that would be the worst. We need to, and that's why I would love an asteroid. I'd love an asteroid to be headed towards Earth right now. I would love for that to be, just, oh my God, we have to come together, and Bruce Willis has got to go blow up an asteroid and, take all the oxygen out of the room to argue about all this other stupid shit.
Yeah.
As to where the alcohol's being made and who's got the electricity and where aluminum's being made. Like, no, the Earth is going to end. Like, we have to go move this rock. Yeah. Everybody pay attention to that for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. We need a galvanizing force.
It would be beneficial as much as it would be stressful.
Right. So we've seen some market turmoil over the last few weeks or so, especially with some of these tariffs kind of being put into place. Some stocks, some parts of the market have got hit a lot harder than others. This is not a serious question, by the way, but it's a good question. So Tesla stock down 35% over the past few weeks, and I think it's down something like 60% this year or something. Still remarkably up over the last 6 months. I don't understand that stock at all. But do you think Trump saying he's going to buy a Tesla, does that change your thesis on the Tesla stock itself?
No. This is not a good question, Josh. I've got a raw nerve and you're jumping up and down on it. I mean, he's pitching cars on the white lawn, on the front lawn of the White House. I mean, when you actually dig into the showmanship that's going on, Saturday Night Live doesn't write this well. Like, it's just, and it's reality. So no, I don't think that helps Tesla stock. But one thing that is interesting, and you gave me some numbers earlier this week, which actually I think is beginning to illustrate the point. One thing we are absolutely seeing right now is, regardless of the origins of the concern and the anxiety, we are having one of our own theses play out that the most overvalued parts of the market are the ones that are hurting the worst, right? So the highest flying, the biggest contributors to the stock market growth are the ones that are absolutely getting pummeled right now. And, I think that's an important lesson and important takeaway and a confirmation that valuations matter. Now, again, we've got a whole cycle to go through, but when things like this go sideways, this is another shining example, because I was even surprised the numbers you showed me, the Canadian stock market's actually holding up better than the US stock market. Yeah. And, we have not been all that constructive on Canada for a while because of the relative domestic economic strength. And, but the saving grace for Canada is it wasn't so highly valued that when shit went sideways, it hasn't fallen nearly to the level, certainly at the NASDAQ, so again, valuations matter is one of the lessons I think that's coming out of this. You asked a Tesla question. I ended up on valuation. I guess that was predictable.
Well, that was kind of the point.
Yeah. And I found in your silly question, I found the point. So
yes, good stuff. Well, okay. So this is another silly question. But I'd like you to predict the next 10 days of this trade war, Colin. And please be specific about which days, which tariffs are going to be put in place on which industries from which country, and the percentages that you anticipate.
I think Donald Trump will lead the news cycle for each of the next 10 days. And I think that at least 3 of the 10 days, his leading of the news cycle will be completely contrary to another message that he had within the previous 7 days. So, you can start tracking that one. So I think 3 of the next 10 days, there's going to be him leading the news cycle with a message that on his face is completely contradictory to something he has said within the last 7 days. Number wise, they're going to be big, very bigly. They're going to be hugely, and they're going to be the best. They're going to be the best of all the tariff numbers. Like, you're going to see tariff numbers like you've never seen tariff numbers before. They're going to be magnificent. Better than anything any president's ever done. So we're going to see the best trade war in the history of trade wars. It's going to be beautiful. It's just going to be a beautiful thing. And
well, I can't wait. I will say, I can't wait.
It's interesting. Well, it's going to be interesting 10 days because we have an unelected prime minister now who's now going to be put in charge. And, can't wait to see how that goes. We have an academic school teacher who's going to get in the ring with, the ultimate warrior, and, they're going to have a cage match. I have no idea how that's going to play out.
What are the chances, like 3 months from now, Carney's just like, I can't do this. I'm out.
I have to imagine in some room, like, out of the public eye, he's going, I can't even, like,
what did I get myself into?
I don't even know where to take the conversation from here.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my Donald Trump impression wasn't as spot on. If I had a chance to rehearse it, I could have probably used more bigly words, but no. And we had this conversation this week with the PM group, and, like, we're trying to find something to trade on. Like, we're trying to find, is there a thread here, any kind of sensical thread you can pull on? And for the love of God, no, like, there really isn't, because a lot of people are suffering from the infinite projection. He announced there's a 25% tariff. That means this is what's going to happen next. Assuming the tariff stays in place forever.
Yeah.
That's a bad assumption. That's assuming no retaliatory tariff. That's assuming that nothing changes. Shit's going to change. Sorry, let's go back to your question. Over the next 10 days, everything we know now, a lot of it's going to be different. Because this is not a static environment. It's not like it's a train track that has been, rerouted and therefore is now a new train track. This is somebody who's just banging on a computer keyboard.
Again, that was kind of the point of the question, is trying to get to the realization that there's not a lot to be done here. If you had a properly built and structured portfolio and plan going into whatever the start of this year, there's nothing that's happened over the last 3 months that should change what track that you're on. Because there could be tariffs or there could not be. And if you position for tariffs and there's no tariffs, then you're going to hurt yourself. If you position for tariffs in Canada and there's tariffs in Europe instead, well, you're going to hurt yourself. So you just kind of sit back and say, you know what? I just need to be flexible, be adaptable, and ride it out a little bit.
Stress causes you to find out how strong you are. So if this situation has directly impacted your financial plans, then there's probably a really good chance you had a bad portfolio. If something in the short term is derailing something material to you, then there's a good chance. When advisors make mistakes, and when mistakes happen in an environment like this, it's often overcommitting to their investment portfolio and not maintaining a safety net. So if you find that your diet is going to be dependent on what the next budget announcement is, then you've gone too far. Like, you should have that much cash on hand to do what you need to do to get through the short term. If you've over allocated, if you invested in a market investment and I'm spending the profits in order to live on, stop it. That's dumb. You don't want your portfolio that exposed to markets. You need to maintain a certain margin of safety. So this is a good gut check to consider that. You're right. Properly constructed, this is what happens. And sometimes we try to convince people that chaos is unavoidable, and that's really uncomfortable. And if you plan for it, it's perfectly comfortable. Like, just accept that this is what's going to happen, and it's going to happen regularly. It's going to happen without warning. It's going to not be forecastable. Once you accept that and you build your portfolio accordingly, now you're good. The stress comes from expecting you can avoid it. The stress comes from, oh my God, I got to get out of the way of this. What do I do now? That's where the stress comes from. And it's unnatural stress. And unfortunately, there's lots of organizations and people that'll feed into that. Were you getting the pitches this week? There's a new AI tool that, figures things out before Wall Street and can tell us what's going to happen next in the market.
I didn't get the pitch, but I know one of my clients did. And this whole thing, I don't know if it's exactly what you're talking about, but this, tell me how much of a scam this sounds like. You put in $250, it can predict 10% growth on whatever stupid investment they're making. You put in $1,000, you become a silver member, it can predict 20% growth. You put in $2,500, it can predict 30% growth, gold member. So those types of things are starting to pop up right now. I don't think it's just tariff related, but it's all this whole, crypto craze, AI craze, probably tariffs to some extent, and people are getting caught up in that the thought that some of the stuff's predictable when it's not.
Yeah, that's the scammiest of the scam. Like that's bigly scam. So
yeah,
but it's again the market for it is there, and people want it. So I'm waiting for the tariff ETF to be launched. Josh, have you seen the tariff ETF?
I haven't. That's got to be bad marketing.
No, I'm thinking that somebody's going to launch an investment product to profit from tariffs.
I'm almost ashamed that I didn't think of this already and look for it, because it's probably out there. Somebody launched that this month, I'm sure.
I didn't mean to shame you, Josh, but
Yeah.
this is how the world behaves. Like, you got something everybody's afraid of. Hey, do you want to profit from tariffs? We have a product you can buy that will, benefit from tariffs. Oh my God, that's amazing. This is my hedge.
Yeah.
I'm going to put 40% of my portfolio in this, and I'll protect my portfolio from tariffs. Why? Because it says so in the name.
So I got one more question for you, and this is probably a good one to kind of end on. Tariff war is over tomorrow, hypothetically. What now?
Another fight. This will give enough oxygen that we're going to go back to Gaza as a strip mall, Greenland as another state, focusing on Europe, the military invasion of the Panama Canal. Any of these other sub stories that are kind of playing out will just go to the top, and it will be equally compelling, equally outlandish, seemingly equally as destructive, unless Donald is leading the news every day. He's not happy. And the best way to lead the news is to pick a fight with somebody who can't defend themselves and, sign executive order after executive order. So the fight will just change. Yeah,
I would even try to take people's attention away from politics in general. Like,
that's good advice all the time.
Yeah, start worrying about other things, or because the reality is there's always going to be something to worry about. So if we're not worried about tariffs, we'll be worried about something else, whatever it is. It does seem like tariffs have taken on a bit of more of a special, for lack of a better word, part in people's brain space at the moment than a lot of events over the past several years, right? I'd say more so than inflation, really, even though inflation seemed to be much more impactful in the moment, more so than some of the wars that we've seen. So this is like the one thing that's dominating headlines more than anything else since the pandemic, I would say.
Yeah. But if it was an inflation war, we would have paid attention to it. I mean, this is a trade war.
I'm pretty sure we described it. The media did at some point as a war against inflation, right?
A war against inflation, but that's an inanimate object. What we have now is a trade war between countries. That's way more compelling. Sure. But I will make a couple comments, because I've had some, I would call them actually unsettling conversations with some very, very good people. And I think some of this feeds out of coming out of the pandemic. There's still people who are isolated. There's still people who made a shift into working from home and or retiring during the pandemic. And they're maybe a little bit more isolated. So they're maybe a little bit more myopic in the news they're getting. If you find yourself trapped in a room or in a space or in a time where you're consuming nothing about all of these things except all of the most egregious things, if that's all you're eating every day, it will wreck your soul over time. You need to, look at kittens, go for a walk, take up pickleball. You need to fill your time with other things, because I think that coming out of the pandemic, we still have a little bit of isolation, and especially people went into retirement during the pandemic or just after the pandemic. Again, isolation's a thing. It's always has been. I think it's a little bit more now. But man, if you're isolated and you get on this wavelength and you start consuming nothing but this news, man, that is fucking terrible. Like, shake your head. Don't do that. It's just bad for your soul. Like, take knitting, take up board games, like, do something, but don't get caught in that loop, and don't hang out with people that are caught in that loop, because they'll drag you down to their level.
It's important to break the algorithm, so to speak, because they can be vicious.
In a positive way.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe we should go back and focus on all the upside that you and I saw in this.
Well, I'll give you one more upside thing, just because we were talking about similar kind of themes at dinner with some of my friends last week. And my friend Steve, we're having dinner, and he goes, tariffs, pretty good for me. Pretty good for me. It's like, he works in a sales business, and he said all of his US clients, they are supportive of Canada, and they'll continue doing business with him as a Canadian. And all of his Canadian clients, they want nothing to do with the US, and all of their business is going to be redirected to Canada. So think of your friends like Steve, who are lovely people and are going to be benefiting from some of this. There will be some winners, and maybe we can focus on them for a while and be happy for them.
Everybody wants to be Steve. Thanks, everybody. Reach out if you have any feedback or you'd like to hear a different topic on one of these podcasts. If you're breaking a sweat trying to figure out what your financial advisor is talking about, you're not getting the service you need. You probably hate trying to get an answer from them, but you also think moving your accounts will be a headache, and it might be. But working with don'trocktheboatwealthplanning.com or .ru isn't exactly stress-free, is it? Call us. We will demystify the world for you.
For more information on the subject of today's podcast or any other financial topic, please visit us online at verecan.com. That's verecan.com. There's plenty of information there, or you can reach out to someone on the team. Thanks for listening. Please note, the information provided in this podcast is for general information purposes only. It is not intended as financial, investment, legal, tax, accounting, or other professional advice. Our discussions are not a solicitation to buy or sell any securities or to make any specific investments. Any decisions, based on information contained in this podcast, are the sole responsibility of the listener. We strongly advise consulting with a professional financial advisor before making any financial decisions. Listeners should be aware that investing involves risks and that past performance is not indicative of future results. Barenaked Money is produced by Verecan Capital Management, Inc., a licensed portfolio management company in Canada. We operate under the regulatory framework established by the provincial securities commissions in the provinces within which we operate. The views expressed in the podcast are our own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any regulatory authority. Remember, at Verecan Capital Management, Inc., we focus on aligning our goals with yours, prioritizing integrity and transparency. For more information about us and our services, please visit our website. Thank you for listening, and let's continue to challenge the norms of the financial services industry together.